In this video, I'm going to show you how I painted and weathered this Adeptus Titanicus Scenic resin base by Unreal Wargaming from start to finish. Despite having degreased the base very thoroughly, I opted for the toughest possible primer in this case in order to avoid any surprises. AK Interactive's black primer with microfiller is as tough as Alclad's, but in fact much easier to spray. Whereas the filler particles in the Alclad one clogged even my trusty Badger, after a few minutes of spraying, this AK primer is a pleasure to spray and offers no such difficulties. As always, I start with an almost invisible mist, letting very little paint through the airbrush. Now, it may not be necessary with a primer with as much bite as this, but I like to hedge my bets. I don't want to bore you to death though, so let's speed things up, shall we? So here's the base fully primed. For the main color I chose Steingrau from the AK Real Colors range. I've used this before with my Warhound Titan base and I quite like the tone. By the way, the funny thing here is that I fully intended to use the AK thinner, the one that I showed to you, but then I picked up the Tamiya one without thinking, and that's the one that I ended up actually using. In any case, the results themselves would not have varied. Like with the primer, you can see that I applied a very light first coat, as I always do, and then gradually built up the opacity. One thing to note is that because these are true lacquer paints, it would actually be possible to go for the water hose method if you like, and spray quite aggressively. Unlike with an acrylic, the paint would self-level without any issues, and it would still be dry in minutes. So if you wanted to be able to spray in a more carefree manner, because maybe you had a huge piece of terrain to do or whatever, this would actually be an ideal paint for that purpose. Another thing I'd like to note is that I did use a different color for the columns, but I forgot to press record for that step, so anyway, here's the finished base coat. Same as with the Adeptus Titanicus armor plates, I went with Ammo Dark Wash mixed with odorless thinner. This is a very dark green enamel that works great for many applications, including airbrushing. Before I forget, it's important to note that I had varnished the base with Tamiya X22 Clear prior to this step. The reason I did that was to help the wash flow as much as possible, but also to make blending in the next stage as easy as possible. As you can see, I'm applying the wash in a rather conservative fashion. In retrospect, I think I could have saved time by basically flooding the area with the enamel, but I really wanted to make sure that staining would be limited. On the other hand, that would have robbed both you and me of the pleasure of seeing the wash flow delicately into those cracks and craters, wouldn't it? There are a few things as satisfying as a pin wash, I think. Having left the wash dry for around 6 hours, it was time for some blending and cleaning up. As you can see, I opted for the new remover sponges from Ammo of Mig. For big, flat surfaces like these, the sponge is not only very effective, but a pleasure to use. The gloss varnish that I mentioned before greatly facilitated the process here, and although there was some staining, of course, I found that it was not really detrimental to the finish. Time for things to get dusty. My idea with the pigments was to go from dark to light, which is kind of the opposite of what one should do when applying mud effects to tanks. This first pigment is Dark Earth by Enamel. By the way, prior to this step I had again applied a varnish, but this time a matte one, namely Tamiya XF86 Flat Clear. The reason for that is that I wanted to avoid the pigment fixer reactivating my wash, and also on this occasion I wanted the pigment to stick to the surface as much as possible. Chances are that you've seen me already apply pigments before, but in case you haven't, let me explain my method a little bit more. I like to sprinkle the pigments onto the surface, so to speak, and then stipple them with a short makeup brush. Because of the matte varnish, the pigments are pigmenting the surface very easily. Unlike with a paint though, this is a subtle coloration. While there are people out there who eschew the use of pigments, I find that I could do almost anything just with pigments and thinner. You can actually do streaks with them, for example, but that's a story for another day. After I'm happy with the result, I like to remove the excess. Sometimes I do that with the airbrush, but in this case I did it by hand. Next time is Europe Earth, which is my favorite pigment of all time, together with Track Rust. The idea is to be more selective and apply it a bit more sparingly than Dark Earth. Dab, 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 you get the idea. Again, I remove the excess pigment, and it's time for the lightest pigment of all, light dust. As you can see, I'm being rather careful with this last one, and I'm concentrating on different areas. I just wanted everything to be like slightly dusty. While you watch me stipple this last one, let me go back to the topic of why pigments are important. Some people argue that it's more efficient to airbrush enamels or even apply enamels manually, and that there are enamel paints specifically designed to simulate dust and dirt. Well, I actually own all of the Ammo Nature Effects enamels, and I've tried them multiple times this way. Yes, it does work, and yes, it's faster, but is the finish the same? Not at all. It's a good time saver, so I can easily see the advantage for wargamers who need to finish entire armies, or especially for commissioned painters. In my opinion, however, nothing beats pigments when it comes to having a realistic dusty finish. If you don't have any enamel-based pigment fixer, just use enamel thinner. But for the love of Cthulhu, do not use water. Anyways, as you can see, the method is essentially the same as that of a paint wash. The Ammo pigment fixer flows very easily into all the recesses with a minimum of effort on my part. The first time that you try this, you're going to freak out because everything will look really dark and it will seem like the pigments have disappeared completely. Worry not, however. It will take several hours for the piece to dry and show its true colors, as it were. Having let the base dry for 24 hours, it was now time to add some more tonal variation with the Ammo oil brushers. This is what we call an oil dot filter or oil paint rendering. As usual, I'm starting with buff. I use the included applicator brush to apply little dots to some areas. Then I take this very short makeup brush, which is great for stippling, and I try to blend the oils. I always try to stipple them dry first, without any thinner, but if there are any stubborn areas, I will then slightly dampen the brush with thinner. Remember though that the oil brushers come pre-thinned, so there is no mixing, no palette, and no cardboard required. As Mike Rinaldi often says, one of the key advantages of this technique is that it can be easily modulated to your needs or tastes. You can make it more subtle or more aggressive. Personally, I would recommend starting off cautiously, because if the effect is not noticeable or strong enough, you can always apply some more dots, right? The effect of the buff dots was nice, but I wanted to create more contrast, particularly as I knew that I would be adding some shading later. Therefore, it was time to take some more risks and add some white dots. And speaking of risks, whoops, well, like I said the other day, this wouldn't be a real Risk for Terra video without some kind of disaster. In this case, I was thankfully able to take that big blob of white paint and turn it into a nice highlight. In fact, I like the effect of the white highlights on the gray so much that I decided to add some more. This wasn't what I had planned, and I do always plan every step ahead of time, but I think it's also important to let go and just go with the inspiration of the moment. As I added more white, I realized that it was somewhat ironic. I had chosen not to do airbrush highlights because I thought that it would look a little bit garish. However, the white oils had effectively become a substitute for that, but I would think that a slightly subtler one. Anyway, food for thought. Then it was time for some rust to add some more variety. I wasn't too sure where to apply it at first, only that I should avoid kind of the center of the model. Reaching all the corners and recesses was becoming very hard with this kind of stubby brush, so I replaced it with a large flat brush. And lastly, time for some dark brown. I purposely decided not to clean the brush, so this would essentially become a kind of reddish brown. In this case, I did use some thinner, and this gave me a more diffuse effect that I was quite happy with. In the last few months, I've had very few occasions to use the many Enamel dry brush paints that I have in my collection, so I really welcome this one. I remembered how I had used the same paint on my much more valuable 28mm Warhound Titan base, and I was eager to see how it would work at this much smaller scale. The main drawback of dry brushing, which we're all familiar with, is that it almost always creates a chalky finish that is very easy to recognize and which for me totally ruins immersion. However, these Enamel paints have a very peculiar consistency, like a gel, which makes it easy to avoid this common problem. What I did, as you can probably tell, is apply the paint less dry than normal, and to do so with very little pressure indeed. I'm almost like caressing the model with the brush. I will let you be the judges of whether it was a good idea to dry brush the base or not, but personally I was very happy with the results in areas like the staircases. Although the base did have a lot of tonal variation by this stage, there wasn't much chiaroscuro going on. Therefore, it was time for some post-shading, in this case with the ash black shader by Enamel. Regretfully, getting this on camera is really difficult for me with my setup, and I ended up sticking my head in front of the lens for most of this step. I hope that the remaining footage gives you an idea of how this works in any case. The main thing was to add shading to corners and the areas where the walls and the floors meet. This I think worked quite well, but it would have been easier with a smaller needle setup. The last step on this project was to add a little finishing touch with the Ammo engine oil, which is a fantastic product with several possible applications. The reason that I wanted to do this was twofold. First of all, if I managed to keep the splattering in scale, it would be a nice way to add even more variety to the surfaces of the base. And secondly, it should convey the idea that this ruined city was a stalking ground of gigantic war machines. I should add that I applied the product without any thinning. You can also thin it with odorless thinner if you want to make it more transparent. So guys, here are the finished results. I must say that I really enjoyed this project, same as it happened with the base for my Warhound or the diorama base for the armored Rolls-Royce. There is something about Scenic bases, dioramas or vignettes that I think really resonates with me. In any case, I hope that you have enjoyed the video as always, and if it has given you inspiration or some new ideas, then my mission is done. Thank you guys, and see you around in our Discord server.